Hello and welcome to your final video on AQA history, migration, empires and the people. We are looking at Unit 4 today in order to finish off the whole course. A final reminder, we've said this in most of our videos, please make sure that alongside watching these you are doing other things, practice papers, flashcards, whatever works for you, mind mapping things, but hopefully this has been a really helpful way of knowing what is across the whole course. So, in our last video we were looking at Unit 3, and most of Unit 3 was looking at India and how India became such an important part of the British Empire, particularly when America became independent. So we are now going to look at how Britain's huge empire, which at one point covered nearly a third of the world, how that started to shrink over time and how Britain has found its place in the modern world. So we have got here we're going to start off by looking at how Britain loses its empire, what are the reasons why that happens, and we're going to look at what Britain now has, which is the Commonwealth. So, one of the biggest reasons why Britain lost its empire was because of the economic hit of the First and Second World Wars. As part of that, not only had it cost huge amounts of money and Britain had to repair, particularly for after World War II, had to repair the country, rebuild things that had been affected by bombing campaigns, but they also had lost their superpower status. It was very clear after World War II that the two major powers were the USA and the Soviet Union. So maintaining an empire became less of a priority for Britain because it was so expensive. And another key reason is this idea that if you've spent the last sort of 6 years fighting against Adolf Hitler because he's taking over more and more land and he's building up his own sort of empire, or as he called it, the Third Reich, then it's quite hypocritical to then say, right, we're going to stop you from doing that, but then go back to your own empire that you've built up over hundreds of years. So the idea starts to grow in people's minds, not just in Britain but across the world, that it is wrong to have colonies and to have an empire. Furthermore, another reason why the war was so important for the end of Britain's empire is that soldiers felt that they'd earned their country's independence. So people across the empire fought on Britain's behalf and felt like as a reward they should be allowed to rule their own affairs and become independent. And the final cause, I would say, is another ideas-based one, is that in places like India but across the empire, Britain prided itself on setting up these education systems and legal systems that taught people these key core British values of democracy, of freedom. And people across the empire, they learnt these values, they realised the importance of them, and then they questioned whether they actually had it. If you're run by Britain, you have no control over who is in charge of you, then do you have democracy? Do you have freedom? So in some ways, I think that Britain sort of shot itself in the foot by teaching those ideas, showed the empire and the colonies involved that they didn't really have them. Without an empire, skipping forward to today, Britain is now left with a Commonwealth. So there are 56 countries who were previously part of the British Empire, and they meet up, they discuss pressing issues that affect them, they offer support, and they compete in the Commonwealth Games every 4 years, sort of similar, sort of smaller scale version of the Olympics. However, even though we share the same monarch, King Charles III is the monarch of each of those members of the Commonwealth, they are independent. They are not ruled centrally by Britain. And we've said that in Unit 3 we saw how India had become the jewel in the crown. So we're going to look at how India particularly got its independence. Remember, since the Battle of Plassey of 1757, a huge amount of India had been controlled by Britain, first by the East India Company and then by Britain itself after the Indian Mutiny or the Indian Rebellion. And in 1947, Britain launched Indian independence. India was able to break away and become independent. And the big reason, as we've discussed, was that they couldn't afford to keep hold of their empire, and particularly a huge country like India. So the northwest of India, which was majority Muslim, became the new country of Pakistan. Initially, as you can see from our map, it was split into West Pakistan and East Pakistan, and then in the 1970s, East Pakistan became the country we now know as Bangladesh. And this process of India and Pakistan being separated and away from Britain is known as partition. And a big driving force for Indian independence, and a really good one to use if you're asked about the role of the individual, if you want to include a role of the individual paragraph, you could talk about Mahatma Gandhi. Now he was a Hindu, a former lawyer, and he used non-violent protests like hunger strikes to demand that Britain withdrew from India. As part of that, he inspired later figures like Martin Luther King with his non-violent approach. So a really key reason why India became independent. The following year, we have another moment in British history that I would say absolutely changes the makeup of our country in a brilliantly positive way. In 1948, with Britain struggling to rebuild after World War II, the government created something called the British Nationality Act. And that stated that everyone who lived in the British Empire was entitled to live and work in Britain. It is a huge moment in British history, but yet if you look at the newspapers, it's a tiny little column. It's hardly mentioned when it is introduced in 1948 because nobody really thought that lots of people would want to come to Britain, but they did. And in the Caribbean, Britain was seen as particularly attractive for two reasons. One, Britain, because of being the central figure of the empire, they were seen as the motherland for a lot of Caribbean countries. They spoke English. They felt that they were British. And also, in the Caribbean, they were having their own economic problems. So the price of sugar was at an all-time low. So that was one of the push factors that led people to look for a better life in Britain. So on the 22nd of June 1948, the ship on our top right, the Empire Windrush, was the first wave of Caribbean migrants to Britain. And from 1948 to 1960, we saw 40,000 Caribbean or West Indian migrants move across to Britain. When they arrived, many of them faced extreme prejudice and extreme difficulty. So people who were very highly qualified, so maybe working as lawyers or doctors, their qualifications weren't always recognised in Britain, so they had to go and work in much lower paid jobs. There was something called the colour bar, where landlords or where employers would ban people from the Caribbean or any black people from renting homes and getting jobs. There were also incidents of racist violence, particularly in Nottingham and in Notting Hill in London. And in response to these riots, when we talk about the impact of the Windrush generation, we could use a couple of individuals to show that. So in response to the Notting Hill riots, a Trinidad-born woman called Claudia Jones set up the Notting Hill Carnival, which you can see pictured underneath on our second picture on the right-hand side. And they were set up in 1959. It is still one of the biggest street festivals in the world that runs every single year. So if you were asked a significance question about the Windrush generation, you could use individuals like Claudia Jones, or perhaps you could use more modern examples like Marcus Rashford, for example, of St Kitts heritage, but's come over and not just made a sporting impact in playing a part for England and Manchester United, but also the effect that he's had on the free school meals campaign, extending that out across school holidays. So have a couple of examples up your sleeve for the impact of the Windrush generation, because it is huge. Skipping forward then to the 1950s, we have something again that shows that Britain's role on the world stage is reducing, and that is the Suez Crisis of 1956. It's seen as a symbol that not only is Britain no longer as powerful as it was, but also that the ideas of having an empire and colonialism are dying, or maybe even dead at this stage. So the man on the top right is called President Nasser, and he was the president of Egypt, and he wanted to seize back control of the Suez Canal. We've talked about in previous units, the Suez Canal was so important because it's a little strip of water that means that you can travel through there on ships rather than going all the way around Africa. So it's a really crucial part of Britain's trade at this time. So when President Nasser seizes back control of the Suez Canal, which Britain had paid for in the 19th century, they wanted to seize it back. Instead of sending in their own troops, they did it in quite a sneaky way, which really came back to bite Britain. They sent troops from one of their allied countries of Israel to invade Egypt on their behalf, and it failed. And not only did it fail, the fact that they used an allied country to invade on their behalf, was seen as an illegal move, and Britain became embarrassed on the world stage. They were heavily criticised by their closest allies, the USA and the United Nations. It was such an embarrassing moment in British history that as a result, the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, who'd replaced Winston Churchill, resigned. We can see here protests on our second picture showing that they say Eden must go. And as we've said, the crisis is viewed as a symbol of Britain's decline on the world stage and the end of colonialism. It's a really key event because following it, after that, Britain starts to allow more countries to leave the empire, like Ghana and Kenya, who we can look at now. So, African independence movements. Ghana and Kenya had been part of the British Empire since the Scramble for Africa, which was the event that we saw between 1870 and 1900, where 90% of Africa becomes controlled by European countries. So, they gained independence in 1957 for Ghana and 1963 respectively. And this is a good one for the role of the individual to show how people campaigned to have British rule removed. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah was his name. He was elected Prime Minister while in prison for campaigning for independence. So Britain completely changes its approach from imprisoning people who ask for independence to then allowing independence to happen and those people in prison becoming Prime Minister. And in Kenya, it was exactly the same story. Jomo Kenyatta was imprisoned for violent protest against the British, but once he was released, he became Prime Minister. And Uganda is an interesting one because they became independent in 1962, and then in 1971, the man on your bottom right, Idi Amin, became the Ugandan president. He's a really interesting one to include in your work for role of the individual, but also maybe ideas and religion, because he said that in 1963 he had a dream where God told him to expel all Asians from Uganda. And there were a lot of Asian people in Uganda because it had been part of the British Empire. So people had travelled over from British-owned India to British-owned Uganda. It was seen as all one big empire. But Idi Amin and a lot of Ugandan people saw the presence of Indian people as a symbol of British rule. So 26,000 Ugandan Asians that had been kicked out migrated to Britain, with many of them located in places like Birmingham. So a really key thing to see how a role of the individual or how religion affected migration to Britain. Skipping forward to the 1980s, we have an event which is probably the only standout one from this unit, where actually Britain is showing that it can keep hold of its empire. Everything else in this unit is about Britain's decline and maybe relying on other countries a little bit more, whereas this one is very much the last stand of Britain keeping hold of an empire. So the Falklands Islands is off the southern coast of Argentina, but it's actually much closer to Antarctica. And there are very few people who live there even today, but it had been owned by Britain since 1833, and it switched hands between Spain, between Argentina and between Britain in sort of the following previous centuries. With Argentina's economy struggling, the man on the top right, a man called General Galtieri, he wanted to boost his popularity. So as a quick win, he decided that he was going to invade and take back control of the Falklands Islands. So he invaded in 1982, and that caused Margaret Thatcher, the woman pictured underneath, to declare war on Argentina. Our Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, she sent 28,000 British soldiers to take control of the Falklands, which they did, and it caused Argentina to surrender, and it forced Galtieri's resignation. And the war saw a huge rise in patriotism, in love of your country, and pride that Britain could successfully defend what was left of its colonies. So even though the Falklands Islands are not particularly important for Britain in terms of an economic sense, there are not lots of people there, but it was a symbol that in this sort of decade or half century since the war of decline for Britain, the Falklands War was a symbol of going, we can still compete on the world stage. It's also a reason, with my football head on, you know, I'm a bit obsessed with football, of why Britain and Argentina, or England specifically, have such a rivalry with Argentina. If you think back to the 1986 World Cup, Diego Maradona punching the ball into the net and getting away with it, the hand of God, that was so celebrated in Argentina because it was seen as revenge for the Falklands War. Our final thing then, before we look at some practice questions, is Britain's relationship with Europe. And you've only needed to have turned on the news over the last sort of 5 years, even more than that now, to hear about Britain and Europe. So as the empire collapsed, Britain realised that it needed to increase its trade with Europe. So it asked to join the European Economic Community. And the EEC was an organisation where European countries would trade and cooperate with each other. Britain voted to join in 1973, and then the EEC became the European Union, or the EU, in 1993. And I imagine you'll have heard of that because it's been in so much of the news. Britain, and previously England, before the Union, before Britain became one country, including Scotland, Wales, and including Scotland and Wales, had often seen itself as separate from Europe, stretching back to the 100 Years' War against France. So thinking all the way back to Unit 1, we have got England fighting against France, and at the end of it, the kings choose to speak English instead of French. It starts to create this idea that Britain is very, very separate from Europe. And those that feel that Britain has a unique history and culture and doesn't need to be united with Europe are known as Eurosceptics. So Eurosceptics would prefer that Britain would stand alone, would not be part of the European Union, and that idea of Euroscepticism has had quite a few impacts over the last sort of 30 years. So in 1999, we saw that 19 EU members, so France and Germany, places like that, they accepted the euro as their currency. So they all had one currency, whereas Britain rejected it and decided to stick with its pound sterling. And moving forward, as we know, another sign of Euroscepticism is the Brexit vote. Let's just get to that and see how one of the key reasons why that happened. So in Britain, immigration from EU countries had steadily increased from 1973 until 2006. And one of the key moments, I think if we track back how we get to the Brexit vote, is in 2004, the EU accepted new member countries from Eastern Europe, like Poland and like Hungary. Because these countries that they were coming from were economically weaker, migration to wealthy EU countries like Britain started to increase. So we see 600,000 migrants arriving from 2004 to 2006. And it starts to create this idea that Britain is being overrun with EU migrants, people coming from other parts of the European Union. Now, in reality, when we look at some of the statistics, net migration, so the amount of people who come into the country if you take away the people who are leaving, has remained pretty steady all the way through. So if you look at our map here, you can see, our graph, on the right-hand side, 300,000 people is about the average. We've had every single year, 300,000 more people have arrived in the country than have left. And fears over migration were a key cause of the Brexit vote of 2016, which led to Britain leaving the EU finally in 2020. And that's the end of our course. That's taken us pretty much up to modern day. So you've got a couple of practice questions here. Because we've not practiced a source question yet, I want to look at one first, and then we've also got our big factors question, which is always worth laying out and practicing how you would answer it if that came up. So first one is a source question. It says, how useful is source A to an historian studying the decline of the British Empire? Explain your answer using source A and your contextual knowledge. So I've found a source here for you, a political cartoon. The provenance at the top says, source A, a political cartoon from the British political magazine Punch, published in 1957. The title is Britannia in Decline. So for this question, when it says how useful, it just means what can we learn from it, and it wants you to tie details from the source to your own knowledge. So we've got Britannia here seen as this sort of symbol of the British Empire, but her chariot is maybe looking a little bit more like a mobility scooter. She's looking like an older lady. She is looking sad and disturbed by what is going on. And it's 1957. We'll come to that maybe when we talk about provenance. So you could describe those details. Just describing the source will get you a couple of marks. And then you can try and link it to your own knowledge. What does that tell you? It tells us that the British Empire, which was so powerful, is starting to shrink. You could mention the economic problems that have been caused by World War I and II. You could mention the ideas of freedom and democracy that have been taught to the colonies, who are now demanding that they receive those ideas of freedom and democracy. Then, for the very top level, you remember you need to mention something about the provenance. So you know that it's a political cartoon from a British magazine in 1957. So you can use that. 1957, hopefully our brain is ticking and we go, that's a year after the Suez Crisis. So we could say it's useful to us because it's from 1957 and it's a British magazine, and it's that 1957 was the year after this huge embarrassing event, the Suez Crisis, where Britain was shown that it could not compete anymore and was in decline. Maybe that's what you would mention and expand that to talk about why the Suez Crisis was so embarrassing for Britain and why it led to Britannia looking so frail and the empire in decline. Final one to practice is your factors question, and I've put in a more specific factors question because we need to prepare for every eventuality. So the ones we've mainly prepared for are, was economic resources the main cause of migration to and from Britain? But there have been examples in our papers where they have been more specific than that, where they have asked you to focus on a specific kind of migration. So I've put in one like that just so that we're prepared for that eventuality. So was war the main reason for the development and collapse of empires? So for this one here, we could go, right, war was definitely a cause of the collapse of the British Empire for the reasons we've discussed, because of the cost of it, because the fact the soldiers had fought for Britain and wanted their own independence. You could think about that, but you could also think about how war has led the development of empires as well. Talk about things like the 100 Years' War, trying to take and maintain and restore the Angevin Empire, even though it in the end it failed. You should try and cover 3 different time frames at least in your 3 different factors. Okay, so remember, in each paragraph try and put in 1 or 2 bits of evidence from different units if possible. So if you've done one from this unit, thinking about the Suez Crisis, maybe go all the way back to unit 1 or 2, collapse of empires. You could talk about the War of Independence of America, led by George Washington, defeating the British, and that's going back to unit 2. All right, so try and get a broad range of evidence from the different units. Okay, I hope this has been useful for you. It is a really tough topic to study because there is so much in it, but I also hope you think it's one of the more interesting topics that you will study in history. Best of luck with your study and with your eventual exams. Bye-bye.